On a night charged with adrenaline, a group of bikers demolished a car, completely unaware that its owner was none other than the legendary Clint Eastwood, sparking a series of events as astonishing as they were unforeseen. The explosion shattered the midnight silence like a hammer through glass. Clint Eastwood's hands shook as he stared at the burning warehouse from across the street, his breath coming in sharp gasps that formed clouds in the December air. Flames licked at the night sky, casting an apocalyptic glow over the Texas waterfront. Sirens wailed in the distance, too late to stop what he'd done, too soon for him to escape unseen. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you are watching us from. We continue. His phone vibrated. Danny Sullivan's name flashed on the screen. He couldn't answer, couldn't tell the young man what he'd just done. The device felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hand. A figure emerged from the shadows to his left. Tall and imposing, the local sheriff approached with measured steps, his badge catching the firelight. Clint Eastwood. His voice was calm but unyielding. "I've been watching you for weeks." "You don't understand," Clint whispered, unable to tear his eyes from the inferno. "I had to do it." 4 people were inside. The sheriff's words fell like stones, including Jeb Callahan. The world tilted beneath Clint's feet. "No," he breathed. "That's impossible. Thunder wasn't. He couldn't be. He was meeting someone. We had the building under surveillance." Clint's knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the cold pavement. "Please," he begged. "You have to believe me. I didn't know. I would never—" The sheriff's expression remained unreadable as he reached for his handcuffs. "Clint Eastwood, you're under arrest for arson and suspected homicide." Behind them, a secondary explosion rocked the warehouse, sending a fresh plume of flames into the sky. The heat washed over them like judgment, and Clint watched in horror as the structure began to collapse in on itself. In that moment, as the sheriff recited his rights, Clint knew with devastating clarity the vengeance he'd sought had claimed far more than he'd intended. Almost 6 months earlier, Clint Eastwood had been a different man. At 55, he had carefully constructed a quiet life in this small Texas town, a respected mechanic with his own shop specializing in classic cars, a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, and a reputation as a man who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. On that warm June morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of his garage as he restored a 1967 Ford Mustang. The car would be his masterpiece, perfect down to the last detail, a testament to patience and craftsmanship. "Looking good," said Danny Sullivan, the 22-year-old apprentice Clint had reluctantly taken on 3 months prior. With his earnest demeanor and natural talent for engines, Danny had slowly earned Clint's grudging respect, despite his unfortunate association with Jeb "Thunder" Callahan's motorcycle gang. "Hand me that torque wrench," Clint replied, his eyes never leaving the engine block. That was why he'd agreed to mentor the kid. Danny had good hands and better instincts, even if his choice in friends left much to be desired. His phone rang. An unknown number. "Eastwood," he answered curtly. "Mr. Eastwood." The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Dr. Reyes from County General. I'm calling about Lester Higgins. You're listed as his emergency contact." Clint's grip tightened on the phone. Scar, his oldest friend, a Vietnam veteran like himself, who had moved to the state capital 2 years ago. What happened? "Mr. Higgins was admitted last night with severe injuries. He's stable, but it would be better to discuss this in person." 3 hours later, Clint stood at Lester's hospital bedside, barely recognizing his friend beneath the bruises and bandages. One arm was in a cast, his ribs were taped, and dark bruises bloomed across what was visible of his face. "Jesus, Scar," Clint whispered, using the nickname that had followed Lester since their deployment. "Who did this to you?" Lester's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly. "Clint," he rasped. "You came." "Of course I came. What happened?" Lester glanced at the door before speaking. "I found something. About the Iron Riders." "Callahan's gang? What about them?" "They're not just running motorcycles and intimidation rackets anymore." Lester's voice dropped lower, They're moving serious product now, meth, heroin, prescription pills. Big operation. I stumbled onto one of their labs while surveying property for a client. Clint frowned. Lester had reinvented himself as a land surveyor after leaving the military. And they did this to you? Thunder himself with those two goons of his, Joe Nails Thompson and Bobby Big Bob Willis. Lester's attempt at a sardonic smile turned into a grimace of pain. Said they were sending a message. Next time they wouldn't stop until I was dead. We need to go to the authorities. With what? My word against theirs? Lester coughed, wincing. The Iron Riders have half the county cops on their payroll. Sheriff's clean, but he can't move without evidence. So we get evidence. I did. Lester's eyes held Clint's. I mapped everything. The labs, the distribution points, the payment structure. It's all on a flash drive hidden in my apartment, taped under the bathroom sink. I'll get it, Clint promised, and make these bastards pay. As he left the hospital that night, a cold determination settled in Clint's chest. He had left violence, behind long ago after seeing too much of it overseas. But for Lester, the man who had pulled him from a burning Humvee outside Saigon, he would make an exception. What Clint couldn't have known then was how quickly this quest for justice would spiral into something darker and more dangerous than he had ever intended. Over the next weeks, Clint became a man possessed. By day, he maintained his business, fixing cars and mentoring Danny. By night, he studied the information on Lester's flash drive, uncovering a complex operation that extended far beyond motorcycle intimidation into serious drug trafficking. He kept the truth from everyone, from Danny, who sometimes asked about his distraction, from his customers who noticed his shorter hours, even from Big Bob's sister Maria, the local diner owner who had been trying to draw him out of his shell for years with free pie and gentle conversation. "You seem tired," Maria commented one evening, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. At 48, she had the kind eyes and resilient spirit of a woman who had weathered life's storms with grace. "Just busy," he lied, hating himself for it. Maria Willis had distanced herself from her brother years ago when he joined the Iron Riders. She didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of what Clint was planning. "Since when do you keep secrets?" Her voice held more concern than accusation. "Since I found out what your brother and his friends are capable of." But he couldn't say that. Not yet. Not until he knew how to bring down the Iron Riders without collateral damage. Instead, he surprised her with a half smile. "I promise it's nothing serious. Just been thinking about the past a lot lately." 2 days later, Lester disappeared from the hospital. First came the call from the confused nurse, then frantic visits to Lester's apartment, which sat empty, the flash drive's hiding place disturbed. When Clint reported him missing, the police were politely unconcerned. Lester was an adult who had checked himself out. He'd turn up. But Clint knew better. His friend's disappearance was no coincidence. That same week, he noticed the surveillance. A motorcyclist following him through town, unmarked cars parked near his shop, his mail showing signs of tampering. He began taking precautions, changing his routines, staying in public places, carrying his old service pistol. Meanwhile, Jeb Thunder Callahan began appearing everywhere, at the gas station where Clint filled up, at the diner when he ate lunch, once even stopping by his shop unannounced. "Nice place you got here," Callahan commented that day, examining a vintage Harley-Davidson Clint was restoring. With his leather vest covered in patches and cold eyes that had seen too much, he exuded menace disguised as casual interest. "You do quality work, Eastwood." "Thank you," Clint fought to keep his voice steady. "I've always admired a man who can fix what others would throw away." Callahan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "By the way, how's old Scar doing these days? Heard he took a nasty fall." The threat was clear, if unstated. "I know he talked to you." "No, he talked to?" "I know what he told you." "Lester's recovering," Clint replied carefully. "He's tough." After Callahan left, Clint made a decision. He needed to find concrete evidence linking the Iron Riders to their drug operation, evidence that would stand up in court and expose the entire network. Lester had mentioned an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, where the main lab was located. If he could document what was happening there, that would be the smoking gun needed to convince the sheriff to act. He spent days observing the warehouse, from a distance noting security patterns, guard rotations, the comings and goings of various vehicles. Most prominently, he saw Callahan himself visit daily, accompanied by Nails and Big Bob, whose intimidating presence kept locals from asking questions. Time was running out. Whatever had happened to Lester could happen to others. The Iron Riders were growing bolder, their territory expanding across county lines. On the night that would change everything, Clint told Maria he was heading out of town for a car. Another lie in a growing collection. Instead, he parked several blocks from the warehouse and approached on foot, his heart hammering against his ribs. The warehouse security was lighter than expected, a single guard at the entrance who seemed more focused on his phone than his surroundings. Using skills acquired during his military days, Clint managed to slip in through a service entrance with a rusted lock. Inside, the cavernous space reeked of chemicals. Partitioned areas held sophisticated equipment, cooking apparatus, packaging materials, scales, and crates of finished product ready for distribution. The operation was far larger than even Lester had described. With shaking hands, he photographed everything: the lab, the drugs, documents showing distribution routes and payment records. The evidence was overwhelming. As he prepared to leave, voices echoed from the entrance. Panicking, Clint ducked behind a stack of crates. Through a narrow gap, he saw Jeb Callahan enter with Nails and a man Clint recognized as a deputy from the next county. "The shipment goes out tomorrow," the deputy was saying. "After that, even if someone raises concerns, the product will be long gone." "Excellent," Callahan replied. "And what about our other problem?" "Still unresolved. The mechanic is becoming problematic." Clint's blood ran cold. "Then resolve it," Callahan snapped. "We've come too far to let one self-righteous old man ruin everything. Use the same approach as with Scar." Scar. Lester. A primal rage washed over Clint. These men had done something to his friend, and now they were coming for him. He must have made a sound because suddenly Nails was alert, peering in his direction. "Someone's here." What happened next was a blur. Clint ran, knocking over equipment as he went. A shout, then a gunshot, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. He reached the exit only to find it blocked by another gang member. Cornered, desperate, Clint grabbed a container of chemicals from a nearby table and hurled it toward an open flame under one of the cooking vessels. The resulting reaction was instantaneous. Fire bloomed like a vengeful flower, spreading faster than seemed possible. The men shouted, rushing to contain it, giving Clint his chance. He fled into the night, the warehouse already engulfed behind him. Only when he reached relative safety across the street did the horror of what he'd done hit him. He hadn't meant to start such a devastating fire, only to create a distraction. Now flames consumed the entire structure, and people were still inside, including, unknown to him, Jeb "Thunder" Callahan, who had been knocked unconscious by falling debris while trying to salvage a ledger of contacts and clients. "I need to speak with my client alone." The voice of Clint's attorney, an old army buddy now practicing law, cut through the sterile interrogation room. 3 weeks had passed since the warehouse fire. 3 weeks in a cell at the county jail, of nightmares where Callahan's face appeared. In the flames of Danny's confused visits and Maria's tearful questions. "Why didn't you tell me? How could you try to handle this alone?" The sheriff frowned, but gathered his files. 5 minutes. When the door closed, the attorney leaned forward. "They found Callahan's body," he said without preamble. "Dental records confirmed it yesterday." Clint closed his eyes, a fresh wave of guilt washing over him. He'd wanted justice, not more. Death. "But," his attorney continued, his voice dropping lower, "they also found evidence supporting your claims about the drug operation. The fire didn't destroy everything. Some of the product and documentation was in a fireproof safe, along with ledgers naming corrupted officials." Clint looked up, disbelieving. The statewide drug task force has made 12 arrests so far, including 2 deputies and a judge. They're facing charges for drug trafficking, corruption, and, he paused, they found Lester. The room seemed to shrink around Clint. Is he... He's alive, but in bad shape. They had him chained in a hunting cabin outside town. The medical team says he's been tortured, but he'll recover. They were trying to find out who else he'd told about their operation. Relief flooded through Clint, momentarily overwhelming. His guilt over Callahan. The DA is willing to reduce your charges to criminal negligence and destruction of property. You'd serve time, but not for murder or arson with intent. His attorney squeezed his shoulder briefly. And you should know, Danny Sullivan came forward. He's been working with the sheriff, providing inside information about the Iron Riders. Says you inspired him to make a change. Later that night, back in his cell, Clint unfolded the letter Maria had brought during her last visit, a letter he hadn't had the courage to read until now. Clint, I've been trying to find the words since they told me what happened. I'm angry that you didn't come to me, that you carried this burden alone. But I understand why. You've always been the type to shield others, even at your own expense. Danny told me everything about Lester, about what my brother was involved in, about your investigation. I wish I could say I'm surprised about Bobby, but truth is I've been watching him slide down this path for years. Still hurts, though. The doctor says Lester's going to pull through. He asked me to tell you he doesn't blame you for any of it. Says you did what any of your old unit would have done, looked out for your own. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if you can forgive yourself for how things turned out. But I want you to know that this town hasn't forgotten who you really are. A good man who tried to do the right thing in an impossible situation. When you get out, and you will get out, there's a place for you here. The shop's being looked after by Danny, and I've saved your usual table at the diner. We'll be waiting. Maria. Tears blurred the words as Clint read and reread the letter. Outside his window, the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of possibility. The weight of what he'd done, the fire, the lies, the choices that had led to this moment, still pressed upon him. A man had died because of his actions. Nothing could change that devastating truth. But in Maria's unexpected forgiveness and Lester's survival, Clint found something he thought he'd lost in the flames, the chance to make amends. 1 year later, Clint stood at the edge of his property, watching as Danny Sullivan worked on a customer's motorcycle. The young man had proven himself more than capable of running the shop during Clint's 8-month incarceration, and now they worked as partners, rebuilding the business and their lives. He was serving the remainder of his sentence on probation, one of the privileges earned through his cooperation in the ongoing investigation that had already dismantled 3 drug networks across the state. Maria approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. In the month since the tragedy, their relationship had deepened, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Her ability to see past his mistakes to the man beneath had been his salvation. "Lester called," she said, handing him a steaming mug. "He's moving back next month, says the city's too crowded for an old country boy." Clint nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. His friend had recovered physically, though the psychological scars ran deeper. Having him nearby would be good for both of them. The Iron Riders were finished. Some members were in prison, others had scattered to the winds. The town felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted. "We should get going," Maria reminded him. "You have that talk at the high school at 2. Clint nodded. Part of his plea agreement included community service, speaking to teenagers about the dangers of gangs and drugs. It wasn't atonement. Nothing could fully atone for a death, even one as unintended as Callahan's, but it was a step toward making meaning from tragedy. As they walked toward Maria's car, Clint felt the weight of the past year in every step. The grief, the guilt, the gradual, painful path toward forgiveness of others, and hardest of all, of himself. But alongside that weight was something else, a hard-won wisdom, and the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, choices remained. Lester had made his choice to expose the truth, regardless of the danger. Clint had chosen to seek justice despite the personal cost. Maria had chosen to stand by him when walking away would have been easier. These choices, imperfect, human, sometimes devastating in their consequences, were the echoes that would resonate long after the immediate pain had dulled. And as the Texas sun beat down on this small town he called home, Clint Eastwood understood that he would carry the weight of silence no longer, not as a punishment, but as a reminder that some burdens are meant to be shared. "Ready?" Maria asked, her hand warm on his arm. He looked at her, steady, forgiving, true, and for the first time in a very long time his answer came without reservation. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm ready."